Welcome back to our next episode of our interview series with Tessa Baines, an intelligence analyst. What do you think are the common elements between auditing and intelligence analysis?
Yeah, so I think we've kind of talked about it. One of the biggest similarities really is the end goal. So both auditing and Intel are trying to affect change in one way or another. We're both trying to get people to do the right thing and to stop them from doing the wrong thing. And we're both doing that by assessing and understanding information. And I'd say in terms of skill sets, following a process, gathering data and information, and doing that with the aim of making a recommendation is similar. So the recommendation for auditing really is whether or not they are conforming or not, and whether or not they can be awarded. Whereas for Intel, the recommendation might be you need to do this thing in order to stop that problem from happening again. So very similar. Both auditing and Intel are governed by a sort of process cycle around how we follow a process to get to those recommendations at the end. And there are some similarities and differences in those, but it's the principle of following that cycle that's quite similar. So like I mentioned, we're both making recommendations at the end, but the steps to getting there are a little bit different.
So then what are the differences? What stands out as the difference between the two?
I think it's really around the sort of the terminology of those cycles is quite different. I think we've got an analysis step where I think you guys have a collating step, something along those lines. So that's probably the biggest difference there. Some of the other differences I'd say are probably around the focus. So where you're focused on compliance, Intel's focused on understanding the past events. We're predicting future behaviours, where auditing is focused on compliance right now and whether or not they'll comply in future. For example, auditors are gathering information to assess whether or not a customer is meeting the requirements and then making recommendations on whether or not to certify or if they have to make the improvements. But in comparison, the Intel analysts are gathering the data and info and comparing it with other data and info and making the inferences about what's happening. So we often deal with partial or more obscure information. And that means we're using more sort of analytical tools to run that information through it to help us piece it together a bit more. And then that's what we're making the recommendations on. So it's not quite as solid as, yes, they did this thing or no, they didn't. It's a little bit more obscure than that. And so a really good way to understand that, I think I've spoken to you about this before, is that the difference with investigations and a bit like auditing is that that's gathering facts, but the Intel is going beyond those facts. So and like I mentioned, the differences around the language and the terminology and the way that we conduct the process is a little bit different, where auditors are making those face-to-face visits. Intel is doing it from pretty much anywhere. You can get the information from a huge range of sources, pretty much anywhere as well. So those are probably the really big differences.
So you said partial and obscure. Like where is the information coming from that's partial or obscure?
So in a police sense, we might get we call them Intel notings. You might get a noting come in that just says, I saw such and such person on this street and they were selling drugs. And you might get 2 or 3 reports like that, and each of those reports might have slightly different pieces of information. So another one could come in that says, Mark was on the corner of this street, but there's nothing about the drugs. So you've kind of got to take all those different little bits, and once you put them in a big pile and run them through your tools, you start to see where some of those similarities are. So while they're all kind of incomplete, once you put them together, they start to make sense. So it's a bit like a jigsaw. You can't really have the whole picture without all the little bits and pieces from everywhere else.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So it's sort of, you're getting all this, and I'll say it's more qualitative, subjective
Yeah, it is. The data that we get, so the quantitative data, at police we did have it, but that's more around the counts of burglaries, the number of burglaries that happened, or whatever crime type you're looking at. And that's obviously all based on what's reported. So there's a whole heap of stuff that's probably happening that's not really getting reported, and we can't really speak to that. But we do have that data available that kind of shows, you know, what's going on, and that's what we base what we're doing off. So we'll start with that and then use all that qualitative information and pull it all together and say, you know, there's this many of this crime type happening, and we know that we've got all this qualitative information that kind of points to the same thing, and it builds a bit of a picture. So we would use those things together to say, this is the number, and this is what we think's going on.
Yeah, that's interesting. I can see how, yeah, a single standalone, subjective, qualitative event, it doesn't have much substance. But then, as you said, you pull a whole heap of that together, and you actually have a bit more. It becomes a bit more objective.
Yes, exactly, and that's sort of where the difference is between having a really good analyst and a fairly average analyst, is that the ones that can pick up bits of information that really might not look like anything and go, that's interesting, and start digging more and more, though that's where the really good analyst will add the value, because they'll see interest, or they'll see something in a piece of information that other people might look at and go, oh, that doesn't mean anything. So that's really where the skill set comes in. You've kind of got it or you don't.
I love that. That's very cool. And it's making me think actually a bit more broader now about, you know, subjective and qualitative, I suppose, evidence that we might come across. Because normally I think, oh no, that, like, you know, that's my opinion or something like that. But if you gather enough evidence, then it becomes a bit bigger, or it sort of backs you up a bit more.
Exactly, and the more you kind of do it, the more you'll start picking up pieces of information that might look really unimportant, and you know, you'll start to be nosy and quite curious about what they're telling you. So you do get better at it over time, and you do start to question things an awful lot more. But I think, especially in the auditing space, that could be so helpful if you, you're not taking everything quite at face value. It's not quite as black and white as that. And if you sort of look a bit further and maybe dig a bit deeper, it could tell you a different picture. Yeah.
Perfect. I love that. Yeah. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on the next episode in this series.